Hi, and welcome to Kathy G in History. Today's topic is death by stabbing, how to identify sharp force trauma in human skeletal remains. But before we move on to today's topic, if you're a fan of the dance macabre and learning about analyzing human remains, you've come to the right place because that's all I do, and I try to upload at least one video per week. So if that's something you're interested in, please invite the like button to your birthday party, but give them a bogus address that takes them to an abandoned lot. After that, please hit the subscribe button and click on the notifications so you'll know when I've uploaded a new video. Okay, now it's time to talk about those stabby marks that sharp-edged blades can leave in the skeleton. When a forensic anthropologist analyzes a skeleton, they are looking for any evidence of trauma that might be related to the cause of death. They are also looking for evidence of healed trauma that can tell us more about how the person might have lived. To do that, they typically categorize trauma into different types according to the type of force that was applied to the bone. The three common categories are sharp force trauma, which relates to any kind of trauma that results from an edged weapon, blunt force trauma, which results from being hit by some kind of blunt object like a candlestick in the library, and penetrating trauma, sometimes also called projectile trauma, although not all penetrating trauma results from a projectile. And this results from something that creates a hole in the bone. Now, in other videos, we'll talk about blunt force trauma and projectile trauma, but this one is all about those sharp objects that you should ideally stay away from. There are a number of different kinds of edged weapons that have been used to kill people throughout history. Of course, there are a variety of different kinds of knives, from Bowie knives to Swiss Army knives and everything in between. Then there are axes and hatchets and machetes, all of which also leave some very interesting marks in their victims. We've seen these employed throughout history to kill people and sometimes dismember their body for reasons that range from ritual to making it easier to transport the body to preventing victim identification. So just what kind of marks do these types of weapons leave in the skeleton? Among the most common injuries seen are cut marks. These are basically incisions, which are longer than they are wide. That makes sense because that's kind of what you would expect from a knife, because that's how the edge of most knives are shaped. Here are some examples of a basic incision wound in the bone. Notice that the edges are all visible and sharp, meaning that there's been no healing. This one is a famous thumb bone. It's the first metacarpal bone, which is that long bone connecting your thumb to your hand. This particular metacarpal is from Francisco de Pizarro, who was the Spanish conquistador who defeated the Inca. He was killed in 1541 when supporters of a rival he had defeated broke into his palace in what is now Lima, Peru, and assassinated him on June 26th of that year. That's my parents' anniversary. Well, not of that year, but that's the same date. Unfortunately, the fact that these cut marks are unhealed tells us that he lost that fight. Now you can see that these cut marks look like what you would expect them to look like. They're longer than they are wide, but there are some other variations and details you can see with sharp force trauma, such as what you see here with these sharp force trauma wounds to the skull of this individual. This person lived in the northern highlands of Peru in about 1100 CE. That's the new AD. You see in these wounds the evidence for sharp force trauma, but you see this kind of variation. Both are basically longer than they are wide, but both also have these odd widened areas in the middle of the incision. So what's that about? Well, if you look at this artist's rendering of what a knife wound looks like when the knife is inserted all the way to the hilt, you can see some similarities with the wounds in this skull. So basically, these wounds were made by sticking the knife all the way into the skull, kind of like I'm sure you've seen in more than one movie. But a knife doesn't have to be shoved through the bone to leave a mark. Sometimes just the tip of the knife can leave a mark in the bone. That's common when you, and I'm not recommending this, cut someone's throat. Most of the time when someone goes to cut another person's throat, they grab that person by the hair and pull their head back to expose the vulnerable part of the neck. Then they cut across the neck using a lot of pressure. By doing that, it's not uncommon for the tip of the knife to slice across the front side of one of the vertebrae in the neck. You have 7 cervical vertebrae, that's 7 neck bones in the spinal column. Here you see the second, third, and fourth cervical vertebrae. And on the second and third cervical vertebrae, you see those little lines going across them. Those are cut marks where a knife sliced across the front side of those vertebrae, as in this case, the individual was beheaded. Here you can see some cut marks on some ribs. These were made when the person was stabbed to death. And in fact, one cut was so forceful that it actually severed the end of the rib. Here's another view of a likely sword wound. You can see the long incision the blade made on the left side of the individual's head. Because the injury is on the left side, that indicates the person's attacker was likely right-handed, and the two individuals were fighting face to face. In this particular case, the wounded person survived. You can tell that because the wound edges have healed over. You see how they're rounded and smoothed. There's also another type of sharp force trauma that is healed visible in this skull. It's the result of surgery performed to save this person's life. That brings us to another type of sharp force trauma, that caused by surgical instruments like scalpel blades. When looking at this image, you see that this large round defect with a hole in the middle. What you notice about this is that the bone edges are all rounded, indicating healed bone. You can also see that the hole here was larger and has filled in, as indicated by the thinner areas of bone. This is a healed trepanation. It was likely performed as a result of the sword injury to save the individual's life. There are a high number of these in the Andean region, and would you believe the neurosurgeons some 500 years ago actually had a better success rate than modern neurosurgeons? It's true, but that might be due to the fact that they could have been performing trepanations on individuals who really didn't need them, like maybe to let the bad spirits out or because of headaches. You wouldn't want to be somebody who happened to have a lot of headaches back then. Here you can see that this is a trepanation where the individual didn't survive. Notice how the edges of the bone are not rounded. They're sharp, and there's no area of new bone like you see in this image. See that layer of porous bone laid down around the hole? That's new bone that indicates this lesion was healing when the individual died. Anyway, these trepanations were made with sharpened instruments, like we see here in this trepanation kit. That's why they constitute sharp force trauma. And there were even paintings done of people performing trepanations, as you see here, from the 15th to 16th century. But wait, you say you want to know about other sharp weapons like axes or machetes? Well, they too create incisions, but they typically do much more damage as well. Sometimes they will take a chunk out of the bone or peel back a layer of the bone. This is a cast made by bone clones, they're really good, of a man who was killed with a machete. You can see the incision-like lines that indicate sharp force trauma, but of course a large part of the skull is missing. And in some places, like here, you see that a piece of bone was peeled off of the underlying bone. That's called delamination, and it's common with axe and machete wounds. Think about it like if you were chopping wood, how sometimes when you pull the axe back out of the wood, a large chunk comes off from around the area where you chopped. That happens in bone, too. So now let's talk about everyone's favorite, saw wounds. With any sharp force trauma wound, you get what's called a kerf. This is the incision left in the bone, and the shape of the kerf can help you determine what made the wound. The following images are taken from a report done for the DOJ by Steve Sims and colleagues who are specialists in this area. They were giving guidelines on how to distinguish sharp force trauma. You can see in this figure, which is included in their report, that the kerf has certain features. These features help us determine what kind of weapon made the cut. V-shaped kerfs like this indicate a knife wound. If the kerf is wider, kind of U-shaped, that might indicate a bigger weapon like a sword or even an axe, and also a saw. You can often tell what type of saw blade was used by the striations that are left behind on the inside edge of the wound. Now, you can't identify the specific weapon used, but you can see if the size of the saw blade is consistent with what may be a suspected weapon. Here you can see some saw striations. From these, you can actually determine how far apart the saw teeth are, and then you can compare those findings with any suspected weapons. Now let's take a look at a couple of more sharp force trauma wounds. This was made from a sword cut. Again, you can see it took out a chunk of the bone. And here you actually have an arrowhead projecting through the bone. This one is particularly interesting. It's a wound of a scalping. So you can see the incision made above the eye there, and some bone was taken out. And that would happen with a knife. They would usually use a knife. They would make an incision above the eye line and then pull the scalp back away from the top of the head. Here you can see some unfortunate Crow Indians who had been scalped in the 19th century. You see their heads are all bald. And here's another image of scalping as well. Here's a man who actually survived. I'm afraid in this case, a comb-over would do him no good. So, to sum it all up, you can distinguish sharp force trauma from other kinds of trauma because it typically involves an incision kind of wound, a line of cut area that's longer than it is wide. But sometimes there can also be areas of delamination or wedge cuts that result from a large weapon impacting the bone and doing damage on the way out as well as the way in. So that's going to do it for today's topic. If you enjoyed this video, please invite the like button to your birthday party, but then give it a bogus address so that it goes to an empty lot. Then laugh maniacally as you click the subscribe button if you haven't already done so, and tickle the notifications bell so you'll know the next time I upload a video. If you're interested to learn more about analyzing skeletons from different contexts, I've also included links to my books in the Archaeology and the Dead series, and I've included a link to my UDE-MY course on how to analyze a skeleton. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.